November 14, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Sea, painting the water in shades of bruised purple and ash. The convoy steams south, 11 transport ships flanked by destroyers, their hulls cutting through the still water like knives through silk. On the bridge of the lead transport, Commander Tanaka Raizo stands with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon. The air smells of salt and engine oil. Somewhere below deck, soldiers sleep in hammocks, their rifles stacked in neat rows, dreaming of Guadalcanal's beaches. The morning is quiet. Too quiet. Tanaka knows this silence, has learned to distrust it. But the convoy is strong, the formation tight, the destroyers vigilant. He allows himself a moment of confidence. Then from nowhere, the sea erupts. A torpedo strikes the transport Kinugawa Maru amidships. The explosion is not loud, not at first. It is a deep, hollow thump that travels through the water and into the bones of every man on every ship. Then comes the fire. Flames leap from the gash in the hull, black smoke pouring into the morning sky. Men scramble on deck, some already burning. The convoy scatters, destroyers racing in circles, their sonar pinging uselessly into the depths. But there is no submarine. No periscope. No torpedo wake to follow. The American submarine that fired is already 800 meters away, slipping silent and deep, its crew listening through headphones to the sounds of the kill. They do not need to see. They have already heard everything they need to hear. And they heard it because of a radio. This is the story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy learned, too late, that the war would not be won by courage alone, but by the invisible architecture of communication, coordination, and a machine that could speak across oceans without wires, without delay, without mercy. In the autumn of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before the invasion of the Philippines, before the fall of Singapore, Japanese naval officers gathered in staff rooms across Tokyo and reviewed American intelligence reports with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Among the documents circulated were technical assessments of U.S. Navy equipment, radar, sonar, and radio communications. The radios drew particular scorn. American ships, the reports noted, carried multiple radio sets per vessel, some capable of transmitting over distances exceeding 2,000 miles. Japanese officers read these figures with raised eyebrows. Why, they wondered, would any fleet require such excessive communication? The Imperial Navy had its own radios, of course, functional, reliable machines built to Japanese specifications. But the Americans seemed obsessed with them, installing radios not just on battleships and cruisers but on destroyers, submarines, even patrol boats. It seemed wasteful. Worse, it seemed undisciplined. One officer, a captain named Fujita Masaru, was quoted in a staff meeting as saying that the American reliance on radios revealed a fundamental weakness in their command structure. They cannot think for themselves, he said. They require constant instruction like children. Others nodded in agreement. The Japanese Navy prided itself on the initiative and independent judgment of its officers. A destroyer captain was expected to make decisions in the heat of battle, without waiting for orders from a distant admiral. This was the spirit of Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan, the warrior's intuition, the ability to act decisively in the moment. Radios, in this view, were crutches for inferior minds. They were tools for men who lacked the courage to command, and if the Americans needed them so badly, then perhaps the Americans were not as formidable as their industrial output suggested. This attitude was not born in a vacuum. It was rooted in decades of doctrine, in the philosophies of Mahan and Togo, in the lessons of Tsushima, where the Japanese fleet had destroyed the Russian Baltic Squadron through superior gunnery and aggressive maneuvering. Communication in that battle had been visual, flags and lamps. Radios had not existed, yet Japan had triumphed. So what had changed? The Japanese Navy believed that the essence of naval warfare remained the same: speed, firepower, and the will to close with the enemy. Everything else was decoration, but the Americans saw it differently. They saw the ocean not as a battlefield but as a system, a vast, chaotic network of moving pieces that could only be mastered through information. And information required communication, constant, reliable, instantaneous communication. The U.S. Navy had learned this lesson in World War I, when convoys crossing the Atlantic had been savaged by U-boats because escorts could not coordinate, could not share contacts, could not warn each other in time. The radio had changed that. By 1941, American doctrine assumed that every ship in a task force would be in constant contact with every other ship, relaying positions, reporting sightings, coordinating maneuvers. It was not a crutch. It was a weapon. The Japanese did not understand this. Not yet. The first convoy sailed from Japan in December 1941, carrying troops and supplies to the newly conquered territories of the South Pacific. They moved in tight formations, destroyers screening the flanks, cruisers providing heavy cover. The escorts were vigilant, their lookouts scanning the horizon for periscopes, their depth charge crews ready. But the American submarines found them anyway. In the early weeks of the war, the kills were sporadic. One transport here, one tanker there. The Japanese attributed these losses to bad luck, to individual submarine commanders who happened to be in the right place at the right time. They did not see the pattern. The pattern was this: American submarines were not hunting alone. They were hunting in packs coordinated by radio. A submarine on patrol would sight a convoy and immediately transmit its position, course, and speed. Other submarines in the area would receive the message and move to intercept, positioning themselves along the convoy's projected path. When the convoy arrived, they would attack from multiple angles, overwhelming the escorts. Then they would slip away, regroup, and do it again. The Japanese escorts heard the radio transmissions, brief bursts of static on the airwaves, but dismissed them as noise. They did not realize that the noise was a conversation, a web of coordination that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. By mid-1942, the losses were no longer sporadic. They were systematic. Convoys that left Truk or Rabaul were being intercepted with alarming regularity. Ships that should have been safe, traveling in heavily guarded formations, were being torpedoed in the dead of night. The Japanese Navy began to suspect that the Americans had broken their codes, and they were right. But even without code breaking, the radios would have been enough. Because the Americans were not just listening, they were talking. Every American submarine carried a high-frequency radio capable of transmitting over 1,000 miles. Submarine commanders were encouraged, ordered, to report every contact, every sighting, every piece of intelligence they gathered. These reports were received by shore stations in Australia and Hawaii, where staff officers plotted the movements of Japanese convoys on giant maps. When a pattern emerged, when a convoy was identified, the shore stations would radio submarines in the area and direct them to intercept. The submarines did not need to search. They were told exactly where to go, and because the radios were reliable, because the transmissions were clear, because the system worked, the submarines arrived in time. Every time. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their submarines operated independently, relying on their own initiative to find targets. Japanese submarine commanders were discouraged from excessive radio use, as it was believed to compromise security and reveal their positions. This meant that when a Japanese submarine sighted an American convoy, no one else knew. The convoy would pass and the submarine would attack if it could, and if it failed, the opportunity was lost. There was no coordination, no reinforcement, no second chance. The Americans, by contrast, missed nothing. If one submarine lost a convoy, another would pick it up. If a convoy changed course, the shore stations would recalculate and redirect the attack. The ocean, which had once been a place of chance encounters and random battles, was becoming a grid, a map divided into sectors. Monitored, controlled, hunted. Commander Tanaka, standing on the bridge of his burning transport in the Solomon Sea, did not know any of this. He knew only that his convoy had been ambushed, that ships were sinking, that men were dying, and that the enemy was invisible. He would survive the attack. He would return to Rabaul and file a report. He would describe the torpedo strikes, the lack of warning, the speed with which the Americans had disappeared. And his superiors would read the report and nod and say that the Americans had been lucky. Again. But it was not luck. It was a radio. Specifically, it was the TBW transmitter, a high-frequency radio set installed on every American submarine by 1942. The TBW weighed less than 50 pounds, ran on battery power, and could transmit Morse code over distances exceeding 1,500 miles. It was not a sophisticated machine by modern standards. It had no encryption, no frequency hopping, no digital encoding. It was in essence a box with a key and an antenna, but it worked. And in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, where distances were measured in thousands of miles and convoys could disappear for days, working was enough. The Japanese did have radios. Their submarines carried Type 96 radio sets, which were comparable in range and reliability to the American equipment. But the Japanese did not use them the same way. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized stealth and independence. Radio transmissions, it was believed, gave away a submarine's position and invited attack. This was true. Radio direction finding technology allowed ships to triangulate the source of a transmission within a few degrees. But the Americans had calculated that the risk was acceptable. A submarine that transmitted its position might be hunted, but a submarine that coordinated with others could sink more ships than it lost. The math favored communication. The Japanese, bound by doctrine and tradition, never made that calculation. There was another difference. American radios were mass-produced, standardized, and interchangeable. Every submarine had the same equipment, used the same frequencies, followed the same procedures. If a radio failed, a replacement could be installed in hours. Japanese radios, by contrast, were often custom-built, with components that varied from ship to ship. Repairs required specialized parts that were not always available. This meant that Japanese submarines sometimes sailed with partially functioning radios, or no radios at all, relying instead on visual signals or pre-arranged rendezvous points. In a war where seconds mattered, where a delayed message meant a lost contact, this was fatal. The Americans also trained their crews obsessively in radio procedure. Every submarine officer knew how to operate the radio, how to encode and decode messages, how to troubleshoot problems. Radio operators drilled constantly, practicing Morse code until they could transmit and receive at speeds exceeding 30 words per minute. The Japanese trained their radio men as well, but the emphasis was different. Japanese operators were taught to minimize transmissions, to keep messages short, to avoid unnecessary communication. This made sense in the context of traditional naval warfare, where fleets operated within visual range and signals could be passed by flags. But in the Pacific, where fleets were scattered across an ocean larger than all the land on Earth, brevity was a liability. The Americans understood that more communication was better communication. The Japanese believed that silence was discipline. By the summer of 1943, the disparity was undeniable. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. The convoy routes from Japan to the South Pacific were becoming graveyards. Tankers carrying fuel, transports carrying troops, freighters carrying food, all were being hunted down and destroyed. The Japanese Navy tried everything. They increased escort strength, added more destroyers, equipped convoys with radar and sonar. None of it mattered. The Americans always knew where the convoys were. The submarines always found them. And the radios, those mocked excessive wasteful radios, were the reason why. There is a recorded exchange, translated after the war, between two Japanese naval officers stationed at Truk in late 1943. One, a destroyer captain, complained that the Americans seemed to have eyes everywhere. The other, a staff officer, replied that it was not eyes, it was radios. They talk to each other constantly, he said. They share everything. We fight as ships. They fight as a fleet. The destroyer captain asked if the Japanese could do the same. The staff officer paused. We could, he said, but it would require changing everything. And we do not have time, he was right. By 1943, the war was already lost. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had begun the war with 6 million tons of shipping, was being reduced by 400,000 tons per month. The submarines, guided by their radios, were strangling Japan. Fuel could not reach the fleet. Food could not reach the cities. Troops could not reinforce the garrisons. The empire, which had expanded so rapidly in 1941 and 1942, was collapsing inward, choking on its own logistical impossibility. And at the heart of that collapse was a communication gap, a failure to understand that modern war was not about bravery or skill or tradition, but about information. The Americans had built a system. It was not elegant. It was not poetic. It was a network of radios, shore stations, code breakers, and submarines, all working together to hunt and kill. The Japanese had built a philosophy, a belief in the warrior spirit, in individual initiative, in the purity of combat. And in the cold mathematics of the Pacific War, the system won. Because the system could learn, could adapt, could communicate, and the philosophy could only endure. There is a particular symbolism in the radio, a machine that speaks without being seen, that connects without touching, that turns isolation into coordination. For the Japanese submarine commanders who sailed alone into the vastness of the Pacific, the radio was a lifeline they were not allowed to use. For the American submarine commanders, it was a weapon as deadly as the torpedoes in their tubes. It allowed them to see the invisible, to hunt the unhuntable, to turn the ocean from a barrier into a battlefield, and it did so not through brute force but through conversation. The transformation was gradual, then sudden. In the early months of the war, Japanese officers continued to mock American radio reliance even as their own convoys burned. By mid-1943, the mockery had turned to confusion. By 1944, it had become desperation. Japanese naval staff meetings devolved into arguments about how the Americans were doing it, how they always knew, how they always found the convoys, how they coordinated attacks across such vast distances. Some officers blamed spies. Others blamed code breaking. A few blamed the radios. But by then it was too late to change. There is a report filed in March 1944 by a Japanese destroyer captain named Saito Hiroshi that captures this realization. Saito had been escorting a convoy from Palau to the Philippines when it was attacked by a coordinated submarine wolf pack. 5 submarines struck within 20 minutes, sinking 3 transports and damaging a 4th. Saito's destroyer dropped depth charges, but the submarines had already vanished. In his report, Saito wrote, "The enemy does not hunt by chance. They hunt by design. They communicate in ways we do not. They see the ocean as we see a map. We are fighting a war we do not understand." The report was filed and forgotten, but Saito had identified the core truth. The Americans were fighting a different war. A war where information mattered more than courage, where coordination mattered more than tradition, where a radio mattered more than a sword. And the Japanese, for all their skill and bravery and sacrifice, had not prepared for that war. The submarines themselves became legends. USS Wahoo, USS Tang, USS Flasher, names that would be remembered, ships that would sink hundreds of thousands of tons of Japanese shipping. But the submarines were not alone. They were nodes in a network, pieces in a system. Every time a submarine radioed a contact report, it fed information into that system. Every time a shore station relayed an intercept order, it tightened the net. The Japanese convoys, for all their courage and discipline, were not fighting submarines. They were fighting a machine, a vast, distributed, tireless machine that never slept, never forgot, never stopped hunting. By the end of the war, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to less than 1 million tons. Entire convoy routes had been abandoned. Islands were left to starve. The once mighty combined fleet, which had sailed with such pride in 1941, was trapped in port, unable to move for lack of fuel. And in the depths of the Pacific, the submarines continued their work, guided by their radios, hunting the last remnants of a navy that had once ruled the ocean. Commander Tanaka survived the war. He returned to Japan in 1945. His transport sunk, his convoy destroyed, his faith in the old ways shattered. In his later years, he wrote a memoir, unpublished, in which he reflected on the war. He wrote about the convoys, about the submarines, about the radios. "We believed," he wrote, "that the warrior spirit would be enough. We believed that courage and discipline could overcome any material advantage. We were wrong. The Americans did not fight with spirit. They fought with systems, and in the end, the systems won." There is a poetic irony in the fact that the weapon which undid the Japanese Navy was not a bomb or a torpedo, but a conversation. The radios did not kill by themselves. They enabled killing. They turned the submarine from a lone hunter into part of a pack. They turned the ocean from a wilderness into a grid. They turned war from a contest of wills into a contest of information. And in that contest, the Japanese were outmatched from the start. The recurring symbol, if there must be one, is the radio itself, a black box, humming with invisible energy, sending signals into the void. For the Americans, it was a tool of abundance, a product of an industrial system that could manufacture tens of thousands of identical units and distribute them across a fleet that spanned the globe. For the Japanese, it was a reminder of scarcity, of a war economy that could not match American production, of a doctrine that valued silence over communication. The radio represented two philosophies of war, one that believed in the power of the individual, and one that believed in the power of the collective. And in the Pacific, the collective won. The epilogue writes itself in the silence that followed. When the war ended, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist. Its ships were scuttled or scrapped, its sailors returned to civilian life, its officers scattered to the winds. The submarines that had hunted them, those invisible fleets guided by invisible voices, returned to their bases, their crews decorated and discharged. The radios, those mocked and misunderstood machines, were packed into crates and stored in warehouses, obsolete within a decade as new technologies emerged. But the lesson remained. War is not won by bravery alone. It is won by those who can see the battlefield clearly, who can communicate across distances, who can turn chaos into order. The Japanese officers who mocked the American radios were not fools. They were products of their time, of their training, of their culture. They believed in what they had been taught to believe. But belief is not enough. In the cold vastness of the Pacific, where steel and fuel and information determined survival, belief was a luxury no nation could afford. The convoys are gone now. The submarines are museums. The radios are relics. But the truth endures, that the invisible can be more deadly than the visible, that the unheard can be more powerful than the spoken, and that in the end, the fleets that hunted by conversation defeated the fleets that hunted by courage, and the ocean, vast and indifferent, remembers nothing.